The Life of Dwight L. Moody. Chapter 45, Within the Gates. Haley, were you ever homesick for heaven? Mr. Moody asked once, at the close of a long, tiring day's work. Do you know, I've just been reading something from Rutherford, and I think I understand sometimes how he felt. See this? And then he handed the book with the passage mark. His absence is like a mountain upon my heavy heart. Oh, when shall we meet? Oh, how long it is to the dawning of the marriage day. Oh, sweet Lord Jesus, take long steps. Oh, my beloved, flee like a roe or a young hart upon the mountains of separation. Oh, that he would fold the heavens together like an old cloak and shovel time and days away and make ready the Lamb's wife for her husband. Since he looked upon her and looked upon me, my heart is not my own. He hath run away to heaven with it. How sweet the wind that bloweth out of the quarter where Christ is. This conversation took place in his early 60s, during the last year of his earthly career. The same longing was at times greatly intensified. Mr. Moody had been spared from bereavement to an unusual degree, and when called upon to lay down the form of his aged mother in her 91st year, there was only a sense of joyful victory that God had so long granted her a mind and body unimpaired. It was his solicitude for others that made him conceal from those nearest him his first symptoms of a breakdown, although doubtless he himself little realized their serious nature. An illness in the home of one of his friends seemed to him an imperative call for Mrs. Moody to remain at Northfield. At the same time, he assured her as to his own health. An invitation had been accepted to conduct a series of meetings in the large convention hall of Kansas City, and Mr. Moody started for the West early in November. Here he was joined by Mr. C.C. Case, who conducted the choir during the mission, and thus describes the few days of sickness preceding his return on November 17th. Tuesday morning at breakfast, I saw that he looked pale and ate little. I asked how he rested, and he said, I slept in my chair all night. Of course I knew if he could not lay down, he was a sick man. I asked him what was the matter. He said he had had a pain in his chest for a couple of weeks, and added, I did not let my family know it, for they would not have let me come on here. I had to urge him for an hour or two before he would consent to call a doctor, but finally he gave in. The doctor made a mustard plaster on his chest, which all at once relieved the pain. He preached 6 sermons after that, but I could see that he was all the time growing weaker. In the last 2 days he had to be taken to the hall in a carriage, although it was only 2 blocks away. When he began speaking, he did not show his weakness, but preached with his old-time fire and spirit. But when he got back to his room, I could see that he was very much exhausted. I tried to make him advise his family of his condition, but he would not until the day he started for home. I think he enjoyed his work in Kansas City as well as any he ever did, from what he said to me. The crowds were greater than any that I had ever experienced with him. The singing pleased him very much, for I had nearly 1,000 voices in the choir. We had an old man's quartet that he particularly enjoyed. Their ages varied from 67 to 82, and he would announce their selection by saying, I want my boys to sing so-and-so. The following letter was written at this time to a very dear friend in Scotland. Kansas City, November 12, 1899. My dear Mrs. McKinnon, I am off here all alone thinking of the past, and you and your good husband have come into my mind, and I just long to see you both once more. It would do my eyes good to see you all and ride down the western coast of Scotland once more. I wonder if I should like your new house as well as your old one. I cannot tell you how much I miss dear Drummond. It does not seem possible I shall not see him again on earth. What a grand time we shall all have when we get to heaven. Only think what a lot have gone home since 1873, when we first met. I get homesick for them sometimes, and yet I would not be off until the work of the Lord has given me to do is finished. The work is sweeter now than ever, and I think I have Some streams started that will flow on forever. What a joy to be in the harvest field and have a hand in God's work. Will you give my warmest love to all old friends and take much for yourself? Your loving friend, D.L. Moody. In conversation with Mr. Vining, a warm friend and former student at Mount Vernon School, he talked of the institutions which he had founded and said that the work in Kansas City was, he believed, as great as any God had given him to do. He spoke of the bereavements that had occurred in his family during the past year, and picking up a copy of his book, Thoughts from My Library, he read a selection that was of peculiar interest now. It was a comment on the text, Psalms 30, verse 5, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." An extract ends with the words, "I have heard it in the land of light, where which I come. There is a time approaching, steadfastly, if not quickly, when the Lord will wipe away tears from all faces. This weary world shall attain joy and gladness at last, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. Wherefore comfort one another with these words." In view of the approaching end, the following paragraphs from one of the last sermons in Kansas City are significant. "I have no sympathy with the idea that our best days are behind us." And he smiled as he related the impression that he had a year before he saw in the papers that old Moody is in town. Why, he said, "I am only 62. I am only a baby in comparison with the great eternity which is to come. We say this is the land of the living. It is not. It is the land of the dying. What is our life here but a vapor, a hearse, and the most common sight? Families broken into. Over there is one who has lost a father, there a mother. There is a pleasant vacancy. There a sister's name is no more heard. There a brother's love is missed. Death stalks triumphant through our midst in this world. Only yesterday I met a mother who had lost her baby. Death in front of us, death behind us, death to the right of us, death to the left of us. See the hospitals in our lands and the asylums for the insane and the blind and the aged. See the great number of jails in our land. 70,000 criminals in our country. But look at the other world. No pain, no death, no sorrow, no old age, no sickness, no bending forms, no dimmed eyes, no tears, but joy, peace, love, happiness. No gray hair, people all young. River of life for the healing of the nations and everlasting life. Think of it. Life, life, life without end. And yet, so many men choose this life on earth instead of the life in heaven. Don't close your heart against eternal life. Only take the gift. Only take it. Will you do it? Near the close of one service, Mr. Moody leaned on the organ and asked the ministers, "Will you ministers allow me to say a word to you?" "Yes, yes. Say what you want," they answered. "Well, I'm not a prophet, but I have a guess to make that I think will prove to be a true prophecy. You hear so much nowadays about the preacher of the 20th century. Do you know what sort of man he will be? He will be the sort of a preacher who opens his Bible and preaches out of it. Oh, I am sick and tired of this essay preaching. I'm nauseated with it. Silver-tongued orators preaching. I like to hear preachers and not windmills." Had he known that this was to be his last sermon, could he have made a more urgent and characteristic appeal in closing than the following? Suppose we should write out tonight this excuse. How would it sound? "To the King of Heaven, while sitting in the Convention Hall, Kansas City, Missouri, November 16th, 1899, I received a very pressing invitation from one of your servants to be present at the marriage supper at your only begotten son. Son, I pray thee, have me excused." Would you sign that, young man? Would you, mother? Would you come up to the reporter's table, take a pen, and put your name down to such an excuse? You would say, "Let my right hand forget its cunning and my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth before I sign that." I doubt if there is one here who would sign it. Will you then pay no attention to God's invitation? I beg of you, do not make light of it. It is a loving God inviting you to a feast, and God is not to be mocked. Go play with forked lightning. Go trifle with pestilence and disease, but trifle not with God. Let me write out another answer. To the King of Heaven, while sitting in Convention Hall, Kansas City, Missouri, November 16, 1899. I received a pressing invitation from one of your messengers to be present at the marriage supper of your only begotten Son. I hastened to reply, by the grace of God, I will be present. Under the imperative order of his physician, Mr. Moody reluctantly consented to cease to work, and leaving Kansas City by the evening train, traveled directly home without breaking the journey, which required a day and 2 nights on the road. On the way, an incident occurred that cheered and encouraged him greatly. From St. Louis to Detroit, the train was delayed by the burning out of the locomotive fire grate, and it was feared that connections would be missed at a later point. The new engineer, who was then to take the train from Detroit to St. Thomas, learned that Mr. Moody was on the train returning home sick, sent word to him that he would do his very best to make up the lost time. Tell him, he said, that I was converted under him 15 years ago, and I owe everything to him. The divisions from Detroit to St. Thomas was covered in the darkness of the night, at a speed averaging a mile a minute, including stops, and the connection for the east was secured. The first intimation that Mr. Moody's family had of his illness was a telegram. Doctor thinks I need a rest. Am on my way home. This was followed at short intervals by other telegrams. Improving rapidly, but have not felt so well for a week. Have you a splendid day, no fever. Heart growing better all the time, no pain. Am taking good care of myself, not only for the loved ones, but for the work I think God still has me to do on the earth. Arriving at Greenfield, Mr. Moody was met and driven 12 miles to his home. He went upstairs with little difficulty to prepare for tea, but never descended again. On reaching Northfield, he telegrammed Kansas City friends, have reached home safely, have traveled backwards and forward for 40 years, and have never stood trip better. Regret exceedingly being forced to leave. Had I been with you tonight, I would have preached on Thou art not far from the kingdom. My prayer is that many may be led into the kingdom under Mr. Torrey's preaching. I want to thank the good people of Kansas City for their kindness and prayers. It was hoped that a complete rest would restore the weakened heart, and specialists were consulted who gave encouragement for an ultimate restoration of health, even if the old-time vigor could never again return. But day by day, his weakness increased. At first, it was almost imperceivable, but it grew steadily more noticeably, until the least effort seemed to tax his strength. Until within a few days of the end, he took the keenest interest in everything and insisted on being told all the latest news of the war in South Africa, over which he was greatly exercised. A few days before the final summons, he was resting quietly with his eyes closed, when suddenly he remarked, I know what I will do if I were old Kroger. Thinking that he had been dreaming, his son inquired if he had a good rest. I wasn't sleeping, he replied. I was thinking of that terrible war. Well, what would you do if you were the old Kruger family? Oh, I would just send a message to Lord Salisbury and state that there had been so many hundreds killed on the Boer side and so many on the English side. And I would say that, as an old man, I should soon have to stand before God, and I didn't want to go before him with all this blood on my conscience, and I would tell England to make her own terms of peace. It was suggested that possibly England herself was not entirely innocent. That's quite so, but if Kruger puts himself in that position after showing the fight he has, England would have to make the best of terms or answer for it in the best elements in her own land as well as in the entire civilized world. God had tried his servants in many ways, but it is doubtful if he ever experienced a severer trial than that of the last few weeks. After 62 years of unusual active life, with the remembrance of not more than 1 or 2 days of slight illness, to be suddenly laid aside, to wait patiently in extreme weakness for God's will, was indeed a severe test. But in this he was found not wanting, and it was with a sense of exuberant and victorious joy that he entered the presence of his Lord and heard the words, Well done, good and faithful servant. As time wore slowly away, slowly to a man of such tremendous activity, he would say that every night he longed for the morning. As he grew weaker, he said he knew now what that verse meant. The grasshopper shall be a burden. On Thursday, December 21st, he had seemed rather more nervous than usual, but nevertheless spoke cheerfully about himself. Asked if he was comfortable, he said, "Oh yes, God is very good to me, and so is my family." No man loved his family and life work more devotedly, and he had often said, "Life is very sweet to me, and there is no position of power or wealth that would tempt me from the throne God has given me." To the world, Friday, December 22nd, was the shortest day of all the year. But for Dwight Moody, its dawn ushered in that day that knows no night. For 46 years he had been a partaker of the divine life, and the transition from the seen world to the unseen, from the sphere of the temporal to that of eternal, was no interruption in the life with which his friends were familiar. For nearly half a century, his one aim in life had been to do the will of God, and he responded with a characteristic readiness to God's summons. Only a few days before his going, in conversation about some future plans, he referred to the possibility of his life work being nearly completed. In reply to a remonstration and an attempt to encourage him, he said, "I'm not discouraged. There's lots of hard work left in me yet, I believe. I want to live as long as I am useful. But when my work is done, I want to be up and off." A few days before the end came an illustration of his characteristic combination of faith and works. While the best medical advice had been secured, he observed the injunction of St. James to call in the elders and to anoint with oil, praying for the restoration of the sick. To within a few hours of the end, Mr. Moody shared with his family the conviction that he was improving. One of his last undertakings was to assume the publication of a monthly periodical to be the organ of the new Northfield extension work. The first number under the new management was received Thursday morning. At once he asked to see a copy, but was advised to wait and not to tax his system. But he insisted on being allowed at least to examine it, just to see how it looks, and for several minutes went through it carefully. After a rather restless night, he fell into a quiet sleep for over an hour, from which he awoke in a sinking condition. During the earlier hours of the night, Mr. Fitt, his son-in-law, had been at his bedside, and he had seemed to rest and sleep a greater part of the time. At 3 a.m, the eldest son took the place as watcher in the sick chamber, and for several hours Mr. Moody was very restless and unable to sleep. About 6 o'clock he quieted down and soon fell into a natural sleep, from which he awoke in about 1 hour. Suddenly he was heard speaking in slow and measured words. He was saying, "Earth recedes. Heaven opens before me." The first impulse was try to arouse him from what appeared to be a dream. "No, this is no dream, Will," he replied. "It is beautiful. It is like a trance. If this is death, it is sweet. There is no valley here. God is calling me, and I must go." Meanwhile, the nurse was summoning the family and the physician who had spent the night in the house. Mr. Moody continued to talk quietly and seemed to speak from another world, his last message to the loved ones he was leaving. "I have always been an ambitious man," he said, "ambitious to leave no wealth or possessions, but to leave lots of work for you to do. Will, you will carry on Mount Hermon. Paul, you will take up the seminary when he is older. Fitt, you will look after the institute, and Ambert, his nephew, will help you in the business details." Then it seems as though he saw beyond the veil, for he exclaimed, "This is my triumph. This is my coronation day. I have been looking forward to it for years." And then his face lit up, and he said in a voice of joyful rapture, "Dwight, Irene, I see the children's faces," referring to the two little grandchildren God had taken from his life in the past year. Then, as he thought he was losing consciousness, he said, "Give my love to them all." Turning to his wife, he exclaimed, "Mama, you have been a good wife to me." And with that, he became unconscious. For a time it seemed that he had passed on into the unseen world, but slowly he revived under the effect of heart stimulants, and suddenly raising himself on an elbow, exclaimed, "What does all this mean? What are you all doing here?" He was told that he had not been well, and immediately it all seemed to be clear to him, and he said, "This is a strange thing. I had been beyond the gates of death into the very portals of heaven, and here I am back again. It is very strange." Again he talked about the work to be done, assigning to the sons of the Norfolk school and to his daughter and her and her husband, the Chicago Bible Institute. Then in answer to the query of his daughter, "But Father, what about Mother?" he replied, "Oh, she's like Eve, the mother of us all," evidently meaning to imply that she was able to mother the whole, and to be to all the interests as well as the children the same helpful advisor and balance that she had been to him for these many years. To the plea of his daughter that he should not leave them, he said, "I'm not going to throw my life away. I'll stay as long as I can, but if my time has come, I'm ready." Then a new thought seemed to possess him, and he exclaimed, "I'm not at all sure, but that God may perform a miracle and raise me up. I'm going to get up. If God wants to heal me by a miracle that way, all right, and if not, I can meet death in my chair as well as here." Then turning to one of the attendants who was applying warm cloth, he said, "Here, take those away. If God's going to perform a miracle, we don't want them, and the first thing, I suppose, we should do would be to discharge the doctor." He did not insist on this, however, but was determined to get up and could not be dissuaded. He then walked across the room to his easy chair, where he sat down for a few moments. A second sinking turn left him exhausted, and he was willing to return to bed, where he remained, quietly awaiting the end for an hour. To the very last, he was thinking of those about him and considering them. Turning to his wife only a little while before he passed away, he said, "This is hard on you, Mother, and I'm sorry to distress you in this way. It is hard to be kept in such anxiety." The last time the doctor approached to administer the hypodermic injection of nitroglycerin, he looked at him in a questioning and undecided way and said in a perfectly natural voice, "Doctor, I don't know about this. Do you think it's best? It is only keeping the family in anxiety." In a few moments more, another sinking turn came, and from it he awoke in the presence of him whom he loved and served so long and devotedly. It was not like death, for he fell on asleep, quietly and peacefully. Of his awakening consciousness beyond the thin veil, which separates the seen from the unseen, we may not know just now, but to the welcome in that city, for which at times he felt such a strange homesickness we may be sure. Did he not himself testify to having been within the gates and beyond the portals, where he had caught a glimpse of the child faces, loved long since and lost a while? During his earthly pilgrimage, it had not been given to him to sing the sweet and joyful melodies that filled his soul, but at that Christmas tide, he joined in heaven's glorious anthems of praise to him, whose love had been a consuming fire, and whom he had served with such devotion when on earth. Of that larger life he had spoken in no uncertain way. "Someday you will read in the papers that D.L. Moody of East Northfield is dead," he had said. "Don't you believe a word of it. At that moment I shall be more alive than I am now. I shall have gone up higher. That is all, out of this old clay tenement into a house that is immortal, a body that death cannot touch, that sin cannot taint, a body fashioned like unto his glorious body. I was born in the flesh in 1837. I was born in the spirit in 1856. That which is born of the flesh may die. That which is born of the spirit will live forever."